Welcome to the third update video on my project, now named Kyzt. You can thank the YouTube commenter Smalls Malone who gave me a very similar idea for the title. Now this is still open to adjustment, but I'm quite happy with it and I'll explain exactly why I love it. First of all, it gives a prominent name to the small disposable enemies who are now known as the Kyzt. Currently I'm unsure as to whether this is a race, a species or some kind of interplanetary nationality. Details are pending. However, the name Kyzt works particularly well, since the Kyzt themselves are small and unintimidating beings, just as the name is short and bears resemblance to the word kids. Secondly, it draws attention to the fact there's going to be a lot of them, or to put it another way, there's going to be a mass of Kyzt. Lastly, there's the obvious pun on the word masochist. This works especially well since the player is effectively going to be working against themselves as they upgrade their enemies. So yeah, it's a good title and I like it. Thanks again, Smalls Malone. Now let's move on to the actual development side of things. I added a couple more criteria for upgrades, namely speed and damage. There's nothing too complicated there. I also fixed another bug with the pathfinding. Basically, if the enemies have a direct line of sight with the player, they ignore their pathfinding algorithm and just run straight towards you. Unfortunately, after removing physical collision between each enemy, I forgot to also allow each enemy to see through each other. This probably took me less time to fix than it did to type and record this paragraph, so yeah, it was a simple fix. Another bug I fixed was with regard to the jumping logic. Basically, the way an entity jumps in my custom-made physics integrator is to adjust its vertical velocity by a factor of their jump height. It would only do this if the entity is touching the ground, but the flag for this is only set once per call of the integrator. In effect, this means the AI would jump several times in the same tick and shoot towards the top of the screen. The fix for this was, again, very simple. It just involves simply setting the touching ground flag after the entity is set to jump for the first time. Now we can move on to something a bit less boring. I added real combat. You don't have to leave angry comments about me being lazy, as I told you to if I forget to add real combat. I'm sure this won't stop some of you, but at least I no longer have to condone it. The invulnerability timer which stops the player from being hit 1 billion times in a second is a bit dirty and I'm sure it'll come back to haunt me, but hey, it's good enough. No, I'm not going to tell you how I did set up the timer, I'm ashamed. However, I did set up a pretty nice knockback system. Before now, I would have a single vector 2 which I named movement vector, which I would perform calculations on before setting the player to move by a factor of movement vector. This works in order to get tight controls since I'm effectively setting movement vector to 0,0 per each iteration of the integrator. However, with things like knockback which can take place over a certain time period, it's difficult to deal with it using only a single movement vector. It would get really messy really fast. Due to this, I've added a second vector called meta vector. I call it meta since it persists over multiple iterations of the physics integrator, getting multiplied by 0.8 each time, so as to provide a steady falloff for the knockback force. When the player is knocked back, it just adds a force of factor knockback force to the meta vector with the sign corresponding to the angle. It's super easy and it yields some pretty satisfying results since the player isn't totally powerless during the knockback. On a minor note, I added a god mode flag sooner rather than later. This is super helpful to test the knockback without having to comment out multiple parts of code. Also, I sped the bullets up just because I wanted to. Lastly, I made the UI a little prettier for some bizarre definition of the word. I added a simple UI background scene which is just the repeating dirt texture for now. I can change it later. And I scaled up some of the font labels. This looks blurry and horrible, but at least now Kyzt looks a little more like a game. Either way, thanks for watching. I hope this was interesting enough for you, and stay tuned for even more updates. However, I have a few exams coming up, so you might not get as many things changed in the next update video. Or I just might release it later, who knows. 50-50.